I'm filling in for Beth Taylor today. She's unable to be here due to health reasons. The objectives of the class is we're going to go over what is DNA, why is DNA valuable, the types of DNA, your DNA results, and the testing companies and resources available. So DNA is an acronym. It stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It is a genetic code. And it defines biological characteristics, and it can also be used to predict our relatives and our ethnicity. When strings of bases or it comes in strings of bases or nucleotides, A, C, T, and G. That's adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine that are paired with their counterparts. Nuclear DNA is located in the cell's nucleus. That is most DNA. 97% of your DNA is nuclear DNA. And when people say they take a DNA test, 9 times out of 10, this is what they're talking about. Base pairs are coiled into the chromosome. So this is kind of a picture of how it looks. Usually it's actually not paired up and it's long and bendy, but there's 23 pairs total for a total of 46 chromosomes typically. 22 of those chromosomes are autosomes. One pair is the sex chromosomes, which is the X and the Y chromosome. That's also the 23rd pair. This is a picture of the chromosomes showing what they look like. This is mitochondrial DNA. So the mitochondrial is the powerhouse of the cell. So the mitochondria is unique in that it's the only part of the cell that has its own separate DNA. And all it does is it just provides a ton of energy for the cells. It's located outside of the nucleus. It's just floating around in the cell. And there's typically multiple copies of the mitochondria in a cell. It has its own unique DNA, special to it. And next, we're going to go over why is DNA valuable. DNA is valuable to us as genealogists because DNA is inherited from our ancestors. From dad, we get 22 autosomes, an X chromosome if we're a female, and we get a Y chromosome if we're a male. From mom, we're going to get 22 autosomes, the X chromosome, and the mitochondrial DNA. Now, with this picture right here, we're going to say hypothetically that this center image is you and your DNA. And each of these jelly beans represents the segments you inherited from a different ancestor. Now, if you also test your parents, what you'll find is that they're going to have half of the colors. They're only going to have the ancestors that are related on their side, but they're also going to have twice as much DNA from each of them. If you go back and test your grandparents, it's going to be the same idea. They're going to have only a fourth of the same ancestors as you do, but they're going to have 4 times as much DNA with the DNA matches that they do have. DNA is diluting over time. And so it's actually best, if you can, to not only take a DNA test yourself, but to test your parents and your grandparents because they are a generation older than you are. And then finally, if we go to our great-grandparents, it just continues on. DNA is valuable when it is compared. If you take a DNA test yourself and the company gives you all this information, that's all great. I mean, that can be useful for health and things like that, but you will not actually get, you won't be able to solve DNA results unless there's a database where you can be compared to your DNA matches. So 2 people share DNA, and when people share DNA, based on the amount of DNA that is shared, we can predict what the relationship probably is, usually within a range. If you share 50% of your DNA, that's going to be a parent-child relationship. A first cousin is typically going to share about 12% of their DNA, and so on and so forth. So when you share DNA, the next thing to do is compare trees and look for a common ancestor. The most recent common ancestor is called the MRCA. So this is your DNA, and this is a second cousin's DNA. And if you look closely at this, there's a lot of colors that are different, but there are some that overlap, specifically the light green and the light orange. Those would be the DNA that comes from the same ancestor. So types of DNA, we have first the Y chromosome. Now this is carried by men. It's inherited from dad, grandpa, great-grandpa, so on, all the way through your father's father, all the way back to Adam, the first man who ever lived. Now, the Y chromosome, you can actually take special DNA tests for it to compare the Y chromosome of two men, and if they match close enough, then it predicts that they share a patrilineal ancestor. We measure the Y-DNA in genetic distance. The larger the genetic distance, the farther back in time the common ancestor is going to be. The most common tests are the 37 marker and the 111 marker tests at family tree DNA. And those test certain amounts of STRs. Those are single tandem repeats. And each one is 37 is testing 37 and 111 is testing 111 respectively. The more they test, generally, the more accurate they're going to be. So if this is your family tree, the Y-DNA is only going to come down this direct patrilineal line. So my last name is Tolman, and so I only, most of my Y-DNA matches are Tolmans. I have a lot of DNA matches on my other side, but I don't see them. If I wanted to test my Yemen or my Merit line, I would have to get a DNA match on one of those sides to take the test for me. Now, this is an example of Beth's Y-DNA matches. So she does not have a Y chromosome herself, but what she did is she recruited her father to take the test for her. And she redacted the names, but the closest matches, most of them have the surname of Taylor, which is her surname. This is a good sign. A lot of times, if somebody has a non-paternal event in their tree or their father is not their father, things like that, then you might expect Taylor matches, but really your matches are going to end up having a different surname. This can also be really helpful if you are adopted and don't know what your genetic surname is. This can give you a place to start. You can go, oh, my biological father is a Taylor somehow, and then you can then work through the autosomal matches and try and hammer down on it that way. So this is an example. One of the great things about Y-DNA is because all the matches can only be related on that one line, you can go farther back with it than you could with a normal autosomal test. So Beth's line went back to Peter Taylor, who was born about 1660 in Parish Sutton, Chester, England. And that was as far as she managed to get. Taylor is a more common name, and there was lots of Taylors in the area that she just couldn't prove which one she was related to. Until she came along and matches 3 and 4 could prove their line back to Christopher Taylor, who was born close by in 1624. There's better records for Christopher, and Christopher was definitely not the father of Peter. But what Beth ended up concluding and proving is that Christopher was actually the uncle of Peter. And from that, she was able to take the Taylor line back a couple more generations. Mitochondrial DNA is carried by everyone, whereas the Y chromosome is only carried by males. And it comes on your matrilineal line. So from your mom, your grandma, your great-grandma, from her mom, all the way back to Eve, or the first woman who ever existed. We can do the same thing with mitochondrial DNA for the same reasons, where you can take special mitochondrial tests to determine if two people are related on the matrilineal line. Now, the mitochondrial DNA mutates really slow. And so between the two of them, I like Y-DNA, and a lot of people like Y-DNA better than mitochondrial DNA. First of all, the Y-DNA is a bigger chromosome than it's about 4 times bigger than the mitochondrial DNA. It's the fastest mutating part of the human genome, which those mutations are what we use to find out how we're related to people. Whereas the mitochondrial DNA mutates really slowly. And the final reason is in Western patriarchal society, usually the surnames follow the Y chromosome, whereas with the mitochondrial DNA, it mutates it mutates really slow, and the surnames are changing every generation typically. But you can do the same thing. The larger the genetic distance, the farther back the ancestor is going to be. Here's a picture of how the mitochondrial DNA goes down. Now, the big advantage to mitochondrial DNA that Y-DNA does not have, well, there's really two. First of all, it's a lot easier for a father to not be the person expected than it is for the mother. It's a lot harder to hide a pregnancy. And the other thing is that because the mitochondrial DNA is inside those mitochondrial cells, and there's multiple copies of it, whereas there's only one copy of the nucleus, it has a tendency to last longer. And so for people like the unknown soldier that was unidentified, who'd been buried in Arlington, for lots of dead soldiers, and it's just easier to figure out who they are with mitochondrial DNA because usually they're autosomal and their Y-DNA has degraded. So Richard III, he was killed in a battle, basically. He was fighting for his throne, fighting for his crown, and he charged into the battle directly and promptly was killed. We knew how he was killed. He was killed by a blow to the head, but then his body was never recovered. In 2002, in Leicester, they were building a parking lot, and they dug up some bones that matched the descriptions of how Richard had died. And they thought perhaps this could be him. And so they wanted to prove it. The way they ended up proving it was with mitochondrial DNA. They were able to recover his mitochondrial DNA, and Richard had a sister named Anne of York, and she had a direct matrilineal descendant still alive who took a DNA test, and her DNA ended up matching Richard III, and that's how they ended up proving that it was him. It ended up being really helpful because Richard being a controversial king, we didn't quite know. Like there was slander about how he looked and stuff, and we learned that he really did have scoliosis, but otherwise he actually was quite a handsome man. Autosomal DNA. This is what most of your DNA is. There's the 22 pairs of numbered chromosomes. So chromosome 1 is the largest, and then they get smaller from there. You get one set from each parent. So you have one full copy of chromosome 1 and a copy of chromosome 2 and 3 and 4 all the way down the list from your father, and the same from your mother. So you get exactly half from each parent. Now, before you inherit them, they recombined. And so your paternal chromosomes are going to be a mixture of your paternal grandparents. For me, that's going to be Tolman and Merritt. And your maternal chromosomes are going to be a mixture of those grandparents. So they're going to be Yeaman and Dastrup for me. And same for you, whatever your grandparents are. And so the key thing is that this is random. And so a lot of people think that they have exactly 25% of their DNA from each grandparent. And on average, that is true. But usually you don't have that exact. You'll typically have one grandparent that you have more from. So in my case, I have 22% from my Tolman side, and I have 28% from my Merritt side. But together, those two numbers add up to exactly 50%. We can use autosomal DNA to solve brick walls and identify ancestors for the past 5 to 7 generations. People disagree, so you might, depending on who you talk to, you might hear different numbers about. Um, you might hear different numbers about what it is, but typically about 5 to 7 is kind of where people agree that it is. We do not inherit DNA from all our ancestors. Over time, some are going to drop off. You are guaranteed to share DNA with your second cousins or closer. We measure autosomal DNA in something called centimorgans, and these are abbreviated as CMs. So centimorgans are named after Sir Thomas Morgan, who discovered them. And basically, their unit of measure, the more centimorgans, the closer the relationship is. So this is an example of your genealogy tree versus your genetic tree. And all we're trying to emphasize is that even though you have ancestor, all of those people really were your ancestors, there's some that you simply did not inherit any DNA from. Using autosomal DNA, this is kind of an example. So this is a match on family tree DNA. And the total amount of DNA was 46 centimorgans. And the longest block was 19 centimorgans. The longer the largest block is, typically, if the longest block is larger than 15 centimorgans, it is a real match. If you have anything smaller than that, you start to get a chance that it's actually just a false positive and the DNA look the same by coincidence. Once you get down to 7 centimorgans, you've got about a third of a chance of that happening. Once you get down to 5 centimorgans, you've got a 50% chance. And once you get down to 3, you've got like a 90% chance. So what we do with this match, because we're confident that this really is a real genetic relative, is we compare the trees. And it turns out that these two people are third cousins. Person A descends from Elias and Nancy through their daughter Sydney, and person B descends through Elias and Nancy through Sydney's sister Martha. And so the 46 centimorgans that they share with each other were passed down through these generations. And so they are literally the living legacy of Elias and Nancy that still persists to this day. Now, the X chromosome, this is the last thing we're going to talk about, for the types of DNA, people get confused by the X DNA. It has its own unique inheritance pattern. All it is the X chromosome is always inherited from mom, and she gives you a random combination of her parents' DNA. And so it's going to be a mixture of whoever your maternal grandparents are. Now, on dad, it's a little bit different. So for mom, it's just working the same as all the other autosomal chromosomes. Dad only typically gives an X chromosome to his daughters. I say typically, there are exceptions to every rule in DNA. So just know that. The first rule of DNA is there's always an exception to every rule. But the rule is that your dad, only had one X chromosome himself. And that X chromosome came from his mother. And he then passes on that chromosome to his daughters. And so a female will always have an X chromosome from whoever her paternal grandmother is. Whereas sons, instead of getting the X chromosome, are getting dad's Y chromosome. In other words, just know that when you're looking at your tree, when you're trying to find a common ancestor on the X chromosome, it's never passed down father to son. So you just have specific lines that you need to look at. So this is the X inheritance pattern for a female. And basically, if it's a white square, you cannot get X DNA from them. And if you look closely at this, it's never going through two men in a row. Whereas it does go through multiple females in a row and down the direct matrilineal line. Now, this is the X pattern for a male. This is the exact same thing, except for the paternal side, the little that was there has just been wiped away. Okay, so your DNA results. Almost everyone who buys a DNA test does it because they're interested in the ethnicity. The ethnicity is actually the least important thing for a genealogist. What they're doing is the short answer is they are comparing your DNA to reference samples. They are also doing some things like statistical phasing to try and make a guess about what your ancestry might be. They usually are pretty good at predicting your DNA down to the continent. And then more specific countries, it becomes harder. Different companies are using different algorithms and also different reference populations. They are regularly updating your DNA, and Ancestry DNA just gave me an update that my DNA, they changed some of their predictions. And so I looked at it, and overall, I felt like it was a little more accurate. I think DNA is going to continue to get more accurate over time. But this is an example of how Beth's DNA has changed over time. This was April 2016 versus 2019 and versus 2023. This is an example of the differences between her ethnicity DNA among the different companies. The interesting thing that she likes to point out is she does not actually have any Scandinavian DNA, and yet all the companies predict her to have it. Okay, so matchless. These are people with whom you share DNA. Your autosomal DNA is based on centimorgans, and the closer the centimorgans, the higher the higher the centimorgans, the closer the relationship is going to be. The Y DNA and the mitochondrial DNA are going to be based on genetic distance. The higher the genetic distance, the farther back the ancestor is going to be. Now, with DNA, the rule is if you share DNA and it's more than 15 centimorgans, there is a genetic relationship. And so your job is to identify the relationship by comparing your family trees. You do this by communicating with them and collaborating with them as much as they're willing, or you start researching them and try and do it on your own if they don't respond. But ultimately, it goes back to paper trail research. And so a lot of times people come and they want help using their DNA to try and solve a brick wall. And you cannot avoid the paper trail entirely. DNA is meant to supplement paper trails where there's gaps. But if you just have nothing but DNA, truly, then it can't be solved. Shared matches is the most important feature that a DNA test can give you. If they do not tell you who the shared matches are, meaning when you look at a DNA match, who the matches are in common between you and them, that is the most important tool. And if a company doesn't give you that, you really can't use them for genealogy. We always like to describe relationships as accurately as we can. So there's going to be first cousin is going to be 1C, first cousin once removed, half first cousin. I have relatives where they are technically my step uncles, and we just like to call them our cousins because it's easier and it feels closer in the family, and that's all fine and good, in our personal lives. But if I were ever trying to write a report where I was explaining how I use their DNA to solve a brick wall, I would use the exact relationships. So when we're using DNA to solve genealogical problems, we identify our biological parents and our family members. That's the first step. Um, so adoptions, this is one of the most common things that we use DNA for. It's really helpful with adoptions. Unknown parentage. This could be you don't know who your parents are. This could be you don't know who your grandparents are, or just a brick wall in your tree. Non-paternal events or misattributed parentage. Basically, your dad is not your dad, your grandpa's not your grandpa, or something like that, where the father of record is not the biological father. This is something that we can solve with DNA, or a lot of times people just discover with DNA and don't know about until it happens. We can also use DNA to help us find relatives that will, for further research, that will help us with our brick walls. Um, but the most important thing is that we are using it to supplement gaps in the records or things that the records are not telling us. Chromosome mapping, this is something that I personally really enjoy doing. Different people have different opinions on chromosome mapping. My opinion is that it takes a lot of time, and it's almost never something I would do for an actual client. But I enjoy doing it on my own. Because what you're doing is you're figuring out which segments you inherited from specific ancestors. And as we learn what traits and genes are on those segments, we can say that we inherited certain traits from specific people in our family. Like you can learn which ancestors you inherited your blood type from, or your hair color, or your eye color. This is an example of a chromosome map. Each segment, each different color represents a different ancestor, and it's showing where the identified locations are. And if the map were perfect, everything would be painted in. There are group projects. There's projects for people who all have DNA from the Vikings, or Nordic DNA, or African DNA, things like that. The most common projects are going to be Y-DNA surname projects. Those are the ones where everybody with the same surname, like Taylor or Tolman, takes a Y-DNA test, and we figure out which ones are descending from this certain common ancestors and which ones aren't. There are thousands of Y-DNA surname projects. And even if you have a common surname like Smith, it's always worth checking to see if there is a project for your surname. I'll give you an example. The Smith surname, there is actually a Smith Y-DNA project that has over 4,000 people in it. And so just because you have a common name doesn't mean Y-DNA can't help you. Haplogroup projects, they're for distant ancestors. They're not something I'm super into. Same with geographic projects. Surname projects are going to be the main one. Okay, so let's talk about the testing companies. So they're in order that they came out, just to prevent any sort of bias. But Family Tree DNA, they are the only company that's going to sell DNA tests for all three different types. You have mitochondrial DNA and Y-DNA, sold uniquely by them. And then you have their Family Finder test, which is their autosomal test. And all the other companies just sell autosomal. They provide ethnicity. All the companies are going to provide ethnicity, DNA matches. Family Tree DNA also provides the segment data, which tells you which segments matched with the person. And that's what you need if you're going to do chromosome mapping. And they also provide a chromosome browser for that purpose. They give you information on your Y-DNA and your mitochondrial DNA haplogroups. if you take the test from them directly, they tell you exactly what the haplogroup is. And something now that they've just recently started doing is if you take a DNA test from another company like Ancestry and you upload it into Family Tree DNA, they will tell you what your Y-DNA haplogroup is if you pay to unlock your test. So even though Ancestry is only really doing an autosomal DNA test, they are actually testing a very limited amount of SNPs on the Y chromosome, just enough to tell you generally what the haplogroup is. And then there's the surname projects. Here's an example of their chromosome browser. And then we're going to go on to 23andMe. They have autosomal DNA only, like all the others. They do predict the haplogroups for Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA just by testing a limited amount of SNPs on each one. They predict the ethnicity. They provide a match list of your DNA relatives. They also sell health data, and that is the main thing that 23andMe tries to market. So they will tell you if you have, if you're more prone to sickle cell disease or macular degeneration or diabetes, things like that. Going bald even is in 23andMe's health data. Predicted traits and Neanderthal percentage. This is something that is just kind of fun. It's not particularly helpful for genealogy, but it is. It tells you what traits scientists believe you inherited from your Neanderthal ancestors. Ancestry DNA. They have autosomal DNA, and they provide ethnicity estimates. They have communities. So the communities are actually a lot more accurate than the ethnicity. And so a community is usually a lot more specific and where your ancestors came from in the past 200 years. So I have Mormons in Utah as one of my communities, things like that. And then your DNA matches. That's the most important part. Your through lines is really cool. I'll show an example of it in a minute. But basically, if you take a DNA test and a DNA match, both go and link your trees to your DNA, Ancestry will scan your trees and try and figure out who the common ancestor is for you based on the matches that are in your trees. They do not give you a chromosome browser showing what segments match with a relative, but they do give you a chromosome painter showing which segments it came from specific ethnicities. So which ones are Scandinavian, which ones are German, which ones are English, things like that. Here's an example of through lines. All of these test takers, Beth and the mystery match, through lines thinks that both descend through her second great grandfather, Joseph Jacob. So this would be a third cousin. You always want to check through lines because sometimes it's not always correct, but it's usually pretty good. Here's an example of the ethnicity inheritance. It actually can split it by parent. And so it tells you which segments of your DNA it believes come from your paternal side versus your maternal side. Really, it's just going to split it by parent 1 and by parent 2 until you go in and tell it which side is which. Okay, next we're going to talk about MyHeritage. So MyHeritage has autosomal DNA and ethnicity estimates. Genetic groups are basically the same thing as the genetic communities in Ancestry. You have your DNA matches. Theory of relativity. This is basically the same thing as the through lines that Ancestry has. The one thing is overall, I think the theory of relativity, in addition to comparing just your two trees, is also using MyHeritage's large database of trees as well. So they have 1 billion trees in their database that they're using. And so sometimes they can figure out how you're related to a DNA match, even if they just have the bare bones in their tree, like their parents. They have auto clusters. So clusters, what they do is they group your matches into people who clusters of people who all share DNA with each other, or most of them share DNA with each other. And often what ends up happening is that everybody in one cluster is related on the same line. Or they're really and so you can figure out, well, which one is your Tolman cluster, which one is your Taylor cluster, which one is your Yeaman cluster. And then with the other people in the cluster who don't really have good trees, well, they're on the Yeaman line somehow. They do offer a chromosome browser, just like Family Tree DNA. So this is really helpful for people who are interested in genetic mapping. Here's an example of their theory of relativities. Works very similar to through lines, where it tells you, we think you're related in this way, and you can confirm it yes or no. Okay, and then living DNA, they have autosomal DNA, ethnicity estimates, and United Kingdom regions. So not only will they tell you that your DNA is British, they advertise that they can tell you exactly where in England your ancestors are from. They give haplogroups and your DNA matches, and then family networks, which are kind of similar to the clusters, I believe. I haven't actually used the family networks as much. Okay, other resources. GEDmatch. I actually am a really big fan of GEDmatch. They are unique in that they do not sell DNA kits. Instead, the only way to get into the GEDmatch database is to test with another company and to upload your DNA. They offer ethnicity tools and one-to-many and one-to-one comparisons. What that basically means is they allow you to see how much DNA you share with your DNA relatives and what other relatives are in the database. And so you can compare somebody who, if you have somebody who took say you have somebody who took a 23andMe test and then they pass away, and then later you find in Ancestry somebody that you think may be their sister. Well, you can't actually test your relative in Ancestry's database because they're now deceased. But what you can do is download the DNA from both of them, put them in GEDmatch, and see if they do, in fact, share a half-sister relationship. There's a lot of tools on GEDmatch. DNA GEDCOM. This is a place where you can analyze and upload your DNA. I'm actually not as familiar with this website, but you can gather DNA data, analyze and compare it. It does have a segment analyzer and a lot of tools on here. DNA Painter. This is created by Johnny Pearl. You do not upload your DNA here, and they do not sell DNA kits, but they do have a lot of tools to help you analyze your DNA and make chromosome maps. So DNA Painter is named for the idea that it's a place where you can map out your chromosomes based on the DNA of whatever company they're in, as long as it provides a chromosome browser. The Shared Centimorgan project is hosted here. This is a crowdsourcing tool created by Blaine Bettinger, where he's gone through and got thousands and thousands of known relatives, the amount of DNA they share with each other, and he's put it into a big table. And so it tells you a first cousin will typically share about 871 centimorgans, I think, but it can be anywhere from like 450 to like 1300. And so you can figure out what relationships are possible by using it. The other main tool on this website is the What Are the Odds tool. Basically, when you have a DNA match, you can, or when you're trying to solve a line on your family, you'll look at a DNA match and you'll look at the shared matches. And if you can figure out how all of the shared matches are related to each other, you can put it in a little pedigree on this website and the amount of centimorgans you're sharing with each one. And then it tells you the most probable places that you fit. So this is really commonly used for adoptees. They're going to not know who their parents are, but they're going to see, well, I'm related to all of these people in the Octavio family, and they're all second cousins to each other, and I share this much DNA with each one, and then it tells you the most likely spot that you fit into the family. Here's a picture of the Shared Centimorgan project. You just put in the amount of DNA that you share into this box, and then it lights up all of the boxes that represent the relationships that are possible. The number for like great grandparent, this 887, that is the average amount of DNA shared for that relationship. And then this is the range. So 485 to 1486, 99% of the time, a great grandparent is going to share that much DNA. Genetic Affairs is another place where you can find new DNA matches, and they have an auto clustering tool. So these are all just places where you can upload your raw data file from Ancestry or whatever company you've purchased from. The genetic genealogy standards, this is just something I want to mention. There's ethical, rules and stuff that have been created by the Board of Certification of Genealogists about how we can use DNA ethically. And so they've added some new standards to the genealogist code, which are freely available to read because we want everyone to follow them. ISOG, this is the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, and basically this is Wikipedia for DNA. You can go as deep as you want into any topic that interests you about DNA. Odds are the answer is here in ISOG. Finally, if you go to familysearch.org, our website, and then you do /DNA, we do have some information available as well. We don't sell DNA tests, and we don't allow the upload of DNA currently, but we do have information about how it's useful and what things you can do with it. If you're interested in reading some books about genetic genealogy, these are some books that we would recommend. Genetic Genealogy in Practice, the Family Tree DNA Guide to DNA Testing, and Advanced Genetic Genealogy by Debbie Parker Wayne. They're all very good. These are all some of the most respected genealogists in the field who have written these books. I've personally read the bottom one, and it's one of my favorite books. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and open it up to questions now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can read the chat. And then any questions that have already been asked, I'm going to start with those. And then if you have any questions, go ahead and add them as well. Okay, so, and if I miss your question, it's just, it may have gotten buried in scrolling. If you feel like I've missed your question, just go ahead and retype it, please. I'm not trying to ignore anyone. Okay. Okay, Dragonfly Lady on YouTube asked, can you explain a SNP? Sure. So a SNP is a single nucleotide polymorphism. And so what happens with our DNA is that 99% of it is identical in all humans. It simply just codes for you to be a human as opposed to like a plant or an animal. And so most DNA is just the same, meaning that of the four base pairs, adenine, cytosine, guanine, or thymine, only one is actually possible. A SNP is a place where a mutation is known to have happened in the past that allows a second variable to be present. And so, usually for most SNPs, um, two of the four letters are an option. So, for example, in one of the ones that controls blood type, the original SNP, I believe, is a C, cytosine. But there is a mutation on this SNP. It's on chromosome 9 that allows it to alternatively be thymine. If you have the thymine allele, then your blood type ends up being type B. And so SNPs, what we do is none of the companies that I talked about today actually test every single base pair, just because that would be very expensive. And so they're testing key SNPs that they know are associated with certain ethnicity results and certain ancestry results to see what values you have there. And when you match enough SNPs in a row to create a matching block called like a segment, then we know that you really must be related because you descend from a common ancestor. It appears my comment was deleted. I do not see a link to the handout on YouTube. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and put that back in. Here's the link to the handout. I hope it makes it to YouTube. I do need to plug in my laptop for a second. I'll be right back. Okay. Family Tree DNA is here. They say, we are working on some new mitochondrial DNA reports. That's awesome. I'd love to get that. One of the things that Family Tree just, I love that they made it so that you can get the Y-DNA results, at least the haplogroup from an autosomal transfer, just to know what the haplogroup was. I hope they do the same thing for mitochondrial DNA as well. Family Tree DNA put the link to their group projects in the chat. We also have some Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA haplogroup projects to help you understand your Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA better. Yeah, I can. I'll put the link to. They're putting some links in the chat on X, which I'll see if I can get those on the screen, so that other people can see them as well. And then here's the one for group projects. Mary says, how do you check for a Y-DNA project? You could use the link that's on the screen currently. What I will usually often do is actually Google the surname I'm interested in and the phrase Y-DNA project. So Tolman Y-DNA project, Robbins Y-DNA project. Still need the handout link. Let's see. Try putting it in the chat again. So Sock Grills says mitochondrial DNA is not one of the 23 pairs. Correct. If you actually look at your raw data file, it usually gets numbered actually as chromosome 26. And they just do that in the raw data file just to help the computer understand it better. Cindy says, I joined late, so I'm wondering if a recording of this will be available. Yes, so we are streaming onto YouTube and X and Facebook. And so you'll be able to see a recording of this there on whatever your preferred platform is. Dragonfly Lady on YouTube says, I have a brick wall. I cannot determine if a match who shares 801 centimorgans is a first cousin or a half aunt. She is non-commutative. What do I do next? So, 801 centimorgans can be either relationship because they're going to share the same amount of DNA. The first thing I would try and figure out is the age generation. If she's the same generation as me, I would probably think it's a first cousin, and if she's older, I'd think it's a half aunt. If you have a specific research question like this, what we'd encourage you to do is to sign up for one of our online consultations. So this is something we started doing during COVID because the Family Search Library in Salt Lake City was closed for a year and a half. And we've just continued doing them. They're free. There's not any catch. So I'm going to go ahead and post the link to those in the chat. It's this online genealogy help. Let's see. I'm getting lots of comments saying, I'm noticing that a lot of the comments saying that they don't have the handout are coming from YouTube. And so I will go pin it to the top of the YouTube video after the video, after I'm done with the live. I don't know why it's not going over there currently, but it is supposed to. Mattia on YouTube says, is it against Family Search terms of service to attach a person profile to a tree based on DNA evidence only, no paper documentation? No, it is not. But unless the relationship is very close, like sibling, parent, first cousin, uncle, things like that, you will probably not be able to solve it without paper trail research as well. But no, if you know, like, for example, I guess a non-paternal event, that your biological grandfather was actually the neighbor as opposed to your grandfather, you could go ahead and put that in the tree. So Amanda says, could you put the link into the chat for the groups in StreamYard? Yes, I can try it. It's just a little bit hard on StreamYard to copy and paste the link, and so that's why I put it on the screen. But let me try again, because I'm glad Family Tree DNA is here and has put those links on. So first of all, we're going to do this one, this groups one. I'm just going to type it real quick. Group project. Okay. This is the link that Family Tree DNA provided. Okay, let's see. Sock Grills on YouTube says, is the 37 and 111 two different tests? So yes, they technically are. So both are testing the Y chromosome, and they're named after the amount of markers that they are testing. The more markers you test, the more accurate the test is going to be. The 37 is cheaper. I think the base price is $119, and then it'll go on sale sometimes. And then the 111 is a little bit more expensive than that. Both tests are going to go on sale sometimes. It's actually a really good time for this webinar because all the DNA companies usually go on sale for Christmas. But yeah, it's technically two different tests. But the really great thing about Family Tree DNA is that they will actually store your spit sample. And so what a lot of people will do is they will buy the Y37 test and just see if they have matches in the database. And if they do, they will then just pay the difference to upgrade their test. It's usually the difference in like $20 is all. And so you can buy the 37, and if you like it, you can go to the 111, or even the big Y, which is the most accurate Y-DNA test that they sell. Let's see. It is impossible to prove a child-parent relationship when the parent has other children to test. Or is it impossible to prove a child-parent relationship when the parent has no other children to test and the parent has no DNA to test because they are deceased? Okay, so I think what you're describing is this is a common thing where you have a brick wall, you're trying to find somebody's father or grandfather, and after you've gone through all the DNA matches, often you find a family where the family, and this is really common, but the family had two brothers, um, and either one of the brothers could be the biological father. Um, the only way to really figure out for sure which one it is to get a DNA test from either the brothers themselves or from one of their descendants. That would be one of their children, or their grandchildren. And if truly none of that is possible, then yes, you really can't prove the parent-child relationship that you're talking about. You can try and get an idea of which of the two brothers is the most likely person to be the father in this example, simply by context, like which one was maybe in the right time and place. Maybe if one's married versus one's single. But the only way to prove it is to test a descendant like you're talking about. Okay, Stella on YouTube. Can you give any insights when dealing with founder effects and or pedigree collapse? So one of the main things that we kind of hope for when we're using our DNA is that each match is only related on one side of our family. And so when you've got pedigree collapse or endogamy, it makes things more complicated. Chromosome mapping is something I will do in those situations to try and help figure out which segments are from which ancestors. But definitely those two things, the reason they're difficult is because they mess up the shared matches. They make it so that you have shared matches from multiple lines instead of just the one. And the shared matches is the most commonly used tool. With pedigree collapse or with endogamy, one of the things that gets recommended is that you only look at centimorgan blocks when you only look at blocks bigger than about 20 centimorgans, because you will have somebody who looks like a second cousin because they share 200 centimorgans. But when you look at the segment size, most of those are going to be really small, just teeny little blocks scattered all over. And that's a sign of endogamy. And so if you're dealing with that, just look for the largest segments and focus on those ones, and know that they're going to mess up the shared matches. Try and just look for people that when you're clustering your matches, that you know can only be related on one side. If you could do that, could you share the other link? Put the other link you shared on the screen. Sure. I'll have to scroll back through. I think we shared the group project one. And then the other one. I'll look for it in a second. It's just in the chat somewhere, and I'm gonna have to just manually type it into it. I don't really have a good way to copy and paste it. Dragonfly. If a female is interested in Y-DNA to trace her father's line but has no brothers, no living uncles, can it be beneficial to test a first, second, third cousin? Yes, it can. So yeah, as long as they are on that direct patrilineal line, it's useful to test them. And so I have brick walls. My Tolman line doesn't actually really have any recent brick walls that I'm trying to solve currently, but I do have other lines in my tree that I would do the same thing. You need to find the right relative. I have a male cousin that descends from my great uncle. Yeah, whatever. Yeah. Basically, you can do that. Amanda says, I think for the next one, I'll watch on YouTube instead of StreamYard. Okay. If anyone else has any other questions, go ahead and post them into the chat. Otherwise, we're to that point where I think I've answered all of them. I did just find the other link that I think was asked for, and I'm just going to go ahead and get that posted real quick. The other thing that we would love for you to please do is, if you could please, I'm going to put a bit.ly link in the chat. We have a post webinar survey. And so if you could go ahead and fill that out, that would be helpful. We just kind of read the feedback. That link go through okay. Okay. So while I'm getting that, the next class that's going to be by the Family Search Library, Thursday at 10 o'clock Mountain Time, we are going to be doing Faith, Service, and Sacrifice, the stories and impact of the Mormon Battalion. And then on a week from today, Tuesday, November 26th at 10 a.m. Mountain Time, we're going to do Find Your Ancestors in Swedish Army and Navy Records from 1682 to 1901. And then that will actually be the last webinar done by the library for the year, just because we don't do webinars in December typically. But I'm going to go ahead and put the link to this page where you can go ahead and mark your calendar or register for one of those other upcoming webinars. Okay, Gail on Facebook says, I'm driving and listening to this. Where can I go back and watch it again? So we are currently live streaming to Facebook, YouTube, and X. So on YouTube, our channel is the Family Search channel. It'll be there. It's also on our X page on Family Search and also our X page on Roots Tech. It's also on Facebook, on our Roots Tech page, and our Family Search Library page. So any one of those, you can go back and find the recording. I'm partial to YouTube. That's the one that I think is just easiest to find. But let me go ahead and put the bit.ly link in the chat. So if you go ahead and just click on it and then just take a few minutes, it usually only takes like 10 minutes to just fill out the bit.ly survey. But we'd love to get your feedback. So I don't see any other questions. So let's see. I'm going to double check now. Something related to South America migration. Okay. Well, as far as South America, one thing that is kind of fun is when people take a Y-DNA test, a lot of times your haplogroup can predict where your ancestries come from. As a general rule, if you take the test and your haplogroup is something like Q, that means that your direct paternal line is going back to Native Americans. Whereas if your haplogroup is R something, that would suggest that it goes back to white people, possibly Spaniards. So I've seen people where their oral tradition was that they were like a direct descendant of Montezuma or something, and then they took the test and it was a European haplogroup. But we're going to go ahead and end the stream now. So thank you everyone for coming. I will go ahead and post the link to the handout on YouTube again. So if you're on YouTube, just hang tight for like a minute and then maybe just refresh the page in about 5 minutes, and hopefully it's there. But thanks everyone, and have a good rest of your day.